So our next speaker is Alison. I don't need to read your bio. I think everyone knows you. You're a very famous person, I think, in the room. Alison is a CEO of Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, ASBEC, as we all know, a national forum of peak bodies in Australian built environment focused on achieving sustainable, productive, and resilient building infrastructure, communities, and cities. She drives a powerful collaboration agenda with industry, government, and not-for-profit leaders for developing national policy and technical solutions that enhance the built environment. You had your great meeting in Canberra last week as well. So with that, please welcome Alison. Your slides are up. So this one should just...
Oh, lovely. Story of my life. Thank you so much for having me, and lovely to be here today. Really appreciate it. What I love is that the premise around DBI is very much the same as ASBEC, and I love that. It's all about collaboration, and from a decarbonisation perspective, we are not going to get there alone. We've got to do it together. Up on the screen there are all the industry bodies that are part of ASBEC, collaborating towards our vision of a sustainable built environment. But part of that magic is that these are the official industry, but that is supported by a beautifully collaborative relationship with academia and government. So when we get together, like we did last week in Canberra at Parliament House, it's a really wonderful conversation that we have. We don't disagree on the vision. It's just good, robust conversations around how to get there. So that's really wonderful. And we do a lot of work to help try and progress policy in that space. And from ASBEC's point of view, we've been around for over 20 years now. We've focused a lot on decarbonising the operational emissions of our built environment, among many other things. But we really, relatively recently dabbled in embodied carbon because there were some really important spearheading publications out there. A lot of the work of the Green Building Council of Australia, some thought pieces around if we do nothing, if we reduce our operational emissions, by the time we get to 2050, embodied carbon is going to have a huge component of our built environment. So we have been focusing there recently, but from an operational perspective, we have not forgotten it and we are still fighting for it. It's really about implementation. So theoretically, we have the technology and the know-how to decarbonise our operational emissions. Our focus is very much on how to make it happen, how to get the renovation agenda happening across our resi and commercial buildings. So that fight continues. But today I thought I'd focus a little bit more on the embodied carbon component because it's a challenge that is a little bit meatier and requires even more collaboration. So the work that we published this year, again, standing on the shoulders of giants, a lot of the previous work that had been done in Australia leading up to our issues paper process that we launched, gosh, it was a couple of years ago now, including the input from the Materials Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance. So great to have you here, Alexi. We essentially did the typical issues paper and then report process that resulted in the publication of our upfront opportunity report. The issues paper explored a lot of the thematics that we needed to consider when trying to figure out how to reduce upfront embodied carbon in the built environment. Understandably really complex because you're talking about the whole building's value chain. So a lot more collaboration required than the simple process of reducing operational emissions in a building. The great part about this work is that from an Australian perspective, we have the benefit of being able to look globally to those leaders who are experimenting with policy and having the wins as well as the losses and really learning from them rather than trying to think of something starting afresh. So no use reinventing the wheel. We're really big on that. So our issues paper went out and we wanted to hear from industry in the sector and government what they thought about how we needed to employ all these methods and where we needed to focus to really look at how we reduce our operational emissions of buildings and of infrastructure. And that's what resulted in our report that we launched in March this year. And the report goes into a little bit more detail, and I love that it will complement your roadmap very well. This is indicative. It's basically, if you just look at a straight line, reduction of carbon from the carbon that we're using today in the built environment to where we need to head by 2020, theoretically, we're going to need to reduce around about 60 to 75% by 2035. You can see the various trajectories of our built environment material supply chains. They've still got a long way to go. I say from a buildings point of view, we've got the technology and the know-how to decarbonise our operational emissions. There are still materials out there that are on their own decarbonisation journeys, and their decarbonisation is not going to get to our 2035 target alone. So we need other levers to help us reduce our emissions beyond that of our supply chain. However, we know that the built environment is a huge consumer of embodied carbon. So what can the built environment do? It can use its influence and leadership to drive a decarbonisation agenda in our supply chain and reward decarbonisation, reward actual decarbonisation and actual reduction of their emissions rather than just paying for offsets. So that's a really important factor. But there are other levers that are just as effective and will also need to be employed at the same time. The biggest one, and some of the biggest opportunities we saw, especially to decarbonise now, was that understanding around how planning and procurement could really encourage low carbon projects. There's so many opportunities from an infrastructure perspective as well as a buildings perspective. The decisions that we make, the decisions around solving problems rather than just approaching it from a straight engineering perspective, maybe thinking a bit more creatively. How do I move people from here to here? How do I make people warm? It's really breaking down the ways that we have traditionally approached buildings and infrastructure delivery. So there's some excellent opportunities and levers to consider. We also recognise that the built environment, as a consumer of materials, we can be a lot more efficient in the way that we use materials and the way that we look after our materials as well. And this sort of goes into principles around circularity and looking at potentially not over-engineering things or over-designing things, or thinking about how we can adopt circularity practices now that have much more longer-term benefits. Again, I've talked about scaling up the supply chain to lower their own emissions. So that's a really big focus, and that work needs to happen now and into the future. But the other really important component of our upfront embodied carbon is around the construction process itself. We know that fossil fuel-free construction is the way to go, whether that means electrifying where possible or potentially investigating more low-carbon liquid fuels to substitute. We know that the construction process needs to decarbonise, much like the transport process. But from a transport perspective, it might be low-carbon liquid fuels or potentially substitution with electrification. But it's also about that mode shift. So if we're thinking differently around how we move materials around the country, that's where this factor really comes into play. So again, talking about how important it is at the planning and design stage, the opportunities for reduction in embodied carbon, especially very much at that concept stage. I know procurement gets blamed for a lot of things out there, but this is before procurement. So we're really focusing on getting knowledge around this decarbonisation hierarchy out there in industry across professions, because it's at the design stage, but the designers need to be aware of materials. So again, highlighting the importance of collaboration, bringing all of those entities and all of those professions that are going to be involved in a project right up front, so you can really workshop what these effective solutions will be. And we found that's been a really great lever to result in really low carbon construction. A report that we released in March had a range of recommendations, and I don't expect you to be able to read these. I'm very happy for you to share my presentation afterwards or go and read the report, which is up on the ASBEC website. I'll provide a QR code link. But I just wanted to show you how, this is 8 recommendations across some very different levers, different stakeholders, different processes, to show you how complex embodied carbon is and to show you how action needs to be happening in a range of different areas. I know for the last couple of decades, we have relied on wonderful levers, wonderful national levers like the National Construction Code to embed many of the principles around reducing our operational emissions. But the code, we cannot rely on it entirely for the embodied carbon perspective. There are so many more levers that need to happen. And not only that, whilst our supply chain remains very similar, if you're looking at buildings versus infrastructure, and therefore the data requirements and the measurements need to be consistent, the policy levers and approaches, whether you're looking at infrastructure, whether you're looking at the resi sector, or even compared to the commercial sector, it is very different. So we are suggesting that the policy mechanisms and basically the change management approaches are different to help different parts of the sector transition and change their behaviours accordingly. So there's a lot of recommendations around what government can do to reward and incentivize lowering embodied carbon. We know that government is a really effective vehicle for creating markets. So we'll see out there, let's just say, I think it was last year, the federal government released its environmentally sustainable procurement policy, asking for reductions in embodied carbon and referring to the tools, the wonderful tools that we have in Australia to be able to measure and report on these reductions. So mechanisms like that really help prompt a market to change. These are really important. Much the same as investment in our supply chain, investment in our materials sectors to look at their own decarbonisation practices and also be aware of what's happening internationally. The elephant in the room is we want to continue to have that level playing field. So what does that mean from a policy perspective? These all need to happen in place. We also need good planning policies. And I know Melbourne has been an absolute leader in this around the policies and processes, federal, state and local, that can really drive that adaptation, retrofit, reuse agenda, leading towards more circularity thinking. I'd also like to point out to another complementary report that ASBEC published in March alongside our embodied carbon report, and it does relate to infrastructure and the understanding for the infrastructure sector and trying to come to a common understanding of what decarbonisation and net zero means in the Australian infrastructure sector. Also mindful of what might happen at a corporate level. We've got a lot of companies out there getting caught into our mandatory climate-related reporting now, climate risk reporting. But what does that mean at a company level versus what does that mean at a project level? And we know, say, the likes of using the PAS 2080 carbon management type processes, how do they work together? So this report helps the industry understand how the corporate reporting can work with the project reporting. So if you haven't seen that report, I encourage you to have a look at that. But that was in March. We're now in November. What has happened? I'm really delighted that momentum is absolutely there and it's wonderful to see. We know that last year, while ASBEC was doing its work, building ministers did agree to have embodied carbon in NCC for 2025. What we know now after the recent building ministers meeting is that NCC 2025 thankfully is going ahead. Rather than being a voluntary Section K in the NCC 2025, which is quite new, that would be a very new and innovative thing if it were to go ahead. It's actually going to be released as guidance, but I think I'll defer to my ABC colleague to give us a bit more insight in that. Regardless, what we need is signalling. And ASBEC report, our upfront opportunity, went really hard on that signalling aspect, because signalling for every single global policy that we looked at, the ones that worked well, they had really clear processes around signalling for a change, then having the measurement and reporting, collecting the data, and then being able to set really clear achievable targets that ratchet down, or as in the carbon goes down, but ratchets up in stringency over time. Super important. And that's a really big message that we got from our analysis of international policy. So that's our report. But wonderfully, this year, the updated trajectory for low energy buildings has embodied carbon throughout. So we know that focus is there. We know the momentum is there. It's really about how we are going to employ our different policy levers and mechanisms to get the changes that we need. And again, knowing that it's not as easy as it has been in the past around operational energy using the NCC. So much more needs to happen. Skills in the sector, practices need to be broadcast, the right way to do things, aligned with those types of circularity principles. So that's in there, and also reflected in the built environment sector plan that was released as well. For the first time, the built environment got its own sector plan alongside all the other decarbonisation plans. I would say the built environment has influence and impact well beyond the built environment sector plan. Transport and transport infrastructure, the industry sector plan, we want to encourage our materials to invest in their own decarbonisation, and the electricity and energy. So the built environment has a lot of impact and a lot of influence. So let's use the influence for good. I promised you some QR codes. That's up there on the screen if you haven't seen our reports and would like to know more. And yeah, really looking forward to continuing to work with you all on these really important initiatives. Thank you. Yeah. Let's see for things.